Good evening, teachers. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the fourth webinar in our series during April Genocide Month, in this case, marking the 90th commemoration of the Holodomor in Ukraine. It is a pleasure to be with you this evening from the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, which is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, with whom we gratefully share this land. My name is Valentina Cureliu. I worked as a department head of history with 35 years of teaching experience with the Toronto District School Board in Canada. Presently, I serve as the Director of Education of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta, with offices in Toronto. HREC was established in 2013, thanks to the generous support of the Temerty Foundation, for which we are very grateful. I am also the chair of the National Holodomor Education Committee of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Because this year is the 90th anniversary commemorating Ukraine's genocide, we created the Webinars for Educators series, which focuses on recently published historical fiction centering on the Holodomor, books which can be used in various ways in classrooms. I am proud to introduce our host for this evening. Mateusz Świetlicki is an assistant professor at the University of Wrocław Institute of English Studies in Poland. He is the director of the Center for Young People's Literature and Culture and a co-founder of the Center for Research on Children's and Young Adult Literature. Mateusz has been a research scholar at the University of Florida's Department of English, Kosciuszko Foundation Fellowship, a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Illinois at Chicago, a visiting scholar at the University of Toronto, and has held multiple other fellowships in Munich, Kyiv, and at Harvard. Dr. Świetlicki is the author of more than 60 scholarly publications in English, Polish, Ukrainian, and Croatian. His work appears in many journals, including Children's Literature and Education and Bookbird. He is the deputy editor-in-chief of Philotechnos, a member of the editorial team, John Benjamin Publishing's Children's Literature, Culture, and Cognition series, and a representative of the Childhood and Youth Network of the Social Science History Association. His latest book, Next Generation Memory and Ukrainian-Canadian Children's Historical Fiction, The Seeds of Memory, examines the transnational entanglements of Canada and Ukraine, and it was published just last month. Congratulations, Mateusz. And thank you for being here tonight to host. We look forward to insights. Now over to you, Mateusz.
Thank you. Let me introduce our special guest, Katherine Marsh, who is an award-winning author of novels for middle grade readers, including The Lost Year, Newer Boy, winner of the Middle East Book Award, The Night Tourist, winner of the Edgar Award for Best Juvenile Mystery, Jeb Who Defied the Stars, a New York Times notable, and The Door by the Staircase, a Junior Library Guide selection. Katherine grew up in Yonkers, New York, in the home of her Ukrainian grandma, who taught her to love stories and borscht. A former journalist and managing editor of the New Republic, Katherine lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband, 2 children, and an astonishing array of pets. The Lost Year is a novel about intergenerational solidarity, survivor guilt, and second-generation memory of the Holodomor. Focalized by 3 teen characters, Matthew, Mila, and Helen, The Lost Year has 2 timelines and is set in Ukraine in 1933 and the USA in 1933 and 2020. Katherine, the floor is now yours for a reading from your historical fiction novel.
Mateusz, thank you so much, Dziękuję, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really honored, first of all, to be here, and I just want to thank HREC for having me, and to welcome all the guests tonight. Привет, hello. So the lost year came out of my experience growing up with my grandmother, as Mathieu mentioned. I am just going to share one quick photo of that before I read. This is a picture of my mother and her cousin, who came to the U.S. in 1933, and it was a very hard time to get here. And Nastya, who's pictured there, they're at the this is after my grandmother passed away, and it's the week, you celebrate this in the Orthodox Church the week after Easter, where you go to the cemetery and you honor the dead. Nastya, my grandma's cousin, after she came, she began to talk very gradually about what she experienced, not very often, but when she did, it was truly haunting. And I remember as a young person hearing her talk a little bit about it, and that influenced this story, as well as the stories, I should say, of my grandmother's sisters who she left behind when she left Ukraine. So I'm just going to give a little introduction to each of these passages that I'd like to read to you tonight. As Mateusz mentioned, my book, it's intergenerational. It has different timelines. It was a way for me to explore the power of stories, and also the power of stories as a way to create relationships and to explore histories that have been lost. And one of the things that was very hard for me when I was young is I remember hearing these stories about the Holodomor, and then mentioning this to people in America, and nobody had ever heard of it. And so that was sort of the reason I sat down to write the book in 2019. So the first passage I'm going to read is from the perspective of Helen. This story is really about one family, the Lomachenko family, and three cousins. And in 1932-33, Helen, who is based very much on my mother's experience, is living in East New York, Brooklyn, with her father, who's Ukrainian, and her mother, who's from Belarus. And she is trying very hard to be an American, the way my mother was. She is in class one day when her teacher ends up reading her something from the New York Times. And I want to read you that passage. Page 3, right column, Roosevelt yields on farm aid bill. Margaret, please read. Margaret Schultz strode to the front of the class, took the newspaper Mrs. Weber handed her, and read, Washington, March 31st, slight modification of the administration farm relief bill was agreed to by President Roosevelt. On Friday afternoons, Mrs. Weber brought a copy of the New York Times to class and called up her favorites to read articles aloud while the rest of us listened. She did this, she said, to improve our vocabularies and make sure we knew what was going on in the world. I tried to listen even as the other kids in my row doodled and dozed, because I wanted to become the intelligent type of person who Mrs. Weber said read the New York Times. But the story was filled with words I didn't know, adjourn, commodity, and soon I was back to my regular worry. What had happened to my cross? Every day I opened our mailbox, hoping to find a letter from Pop's family thanking me for sending it. I imagined racing up the stairwell to our apartment, handing it to Pop. His face would brighten for the first time in months, and he'd forget all about how he couldn't work, how he'd had to move to a smaller, cheaper apartment, how Mom cleaned houses and office buildings morning till night to support us. He'd read that letter, and all his sadness would wash away, and his weakened heart would grow strong. You saved them, Yanichka, he would say, my good, clever girl. But it had been 3 months, and there had been no word from anyone in Ukraine. Does anyone want to summarize what Margaret has just read? Mrs. Weber asked. I snapped back to class. Ruth's hand was raised, but Mrs. Weber was looking over at the rest of us. Even though she hardly ever called on me, I quickly peered down at my desk in case she was tempted. Finally, I heard Mrs. Weber sigh. Go ahead, Ruth. Some extra commodities, peanuts and flax, were added to the president's farm relief bill, so more senators would vote for it. That's what commodities were, I thought. Things you'd buy in a store, like the one Ruth's parents ran. Flax, though, I had no idea what that was. I thought about asking Ruth after class, but I didn't want her to think I was an idiot like Mrs. Weber did. Helen doesn't have much to say for herself, she had written on my last report card, but she has a very nice smile. Thank you, Mrs. Weber said, although she sounded less appreciative of Ruth than disappointed in the rest of us. I glanced at the clock, 15 minutes left, 25 and I would be home checking the mail. Maybe today would be the day. Mrs. Weber called up Joseph, the class math whiz, who took the paper from Margaret. Listen, I told myself, but already I could feel my attention drifting. Page 13, left column, Mrs. Weber said, Russians hungry but not starving. An electric tingle ran through my body. Had I imagined that? Misheard? But no, Joseph was reading now. Moscow, March 30th. There appears from a British source a big scare story in the American press about famine in the Soviet Union, with thousands already dead and millions more menaced by death from starvation. Its author is Gareth Jones, who's a former secretary to David Lloyd George and who recently spent 3 weeks in the Soviet Union and reached the conclusion that the country was on the verge of a terrific smash. Blood rushed to my face. What was the New York Times reporter talking about? Pop's family wasn't just hungry. They had written they were starving, that they had nothing to eat. Maybe I'd misunderstood what the New York Times was saying. I leaned forward, listening with my whole body, trying to make sense of what Joseph was reading. Mr. Jones is a man of keen and active mind, and he has taken the trouble to learn Russian, which he speaks with considerable fluency. But this writer thought Mr. Jones's judgment was somewhat hasty. Conditions are bad, but there is no famine. My hand shut up before I could stop it. Helen, Mrs. Weber said, her voice caught between irritation and surprise. Joseph stopped mid-sentence. Every pair of eyes in the classroom was on me. That's not true. I'm going to stop right there with that passage. But as Matuj mentioned, my background is in journalism. So one of the pieces of this book that really interested me professionally, both as a journalist and a children's book author, was the story of Walter Duranty and how he used basically reported disinformation that really shaped the historical narrative of what people knew globally about this famine. And so this is a moment where Helen really experiences that firsthand. Now, the other passage I'm going to read is from a chapter that is from the perspective of Mila, who is another of the cousins. Mila lives in Kyiv. Her father is an official in the Ukrainian Communist Party, and he's kind of drunk the Kool-Aid. And so Mila has grown up very spoiled and very unaware, but her life changes one day when a girl shows up at the door of her apartment who is starving and begging for food and who claims that she's her cousin. Now, Mila at this point is not aware that she has cousins. So this is a surprise to her, but she eventually decides that she needs to know more. And she befriends this girl whose name is Nadia and who is indeed her cousin. And she finally, after a while, gets Nadia to open up about what she's experienced. And I want to read a little bit about that. Mila has been under the misimpression that Nadia, by the way, is an only child. And she discovers that, in fact, she had brothers, and that had is an operative term here. So Nadia describes them to her. You would have loved them, Mila. Antin had hair like a duck's. It stood straight up. He was always getting into trouble. He loved cherries. He would climb our cherry tree, come in for dinner with his shirt stained with juice. Mikola was quiet. He could watch ants marching for hours. He measured the water of a melting icicle one winter to know how much was inside it. He loved to sled. Winter used to be a lovely time in our village. Ivanko, our neighbor, had a hill. We'd sled down it. Nadia felt quiet. I wondered if she was imagining sledding with her brothers. I could almost imagine it myself. Antin's shouts of delight, Mikola's head turned up to watch the snowflakes swirling out of a gray sky, the three of them intertwined on a single sled and streaming down Ivanko's hill, rosy-cheeked, bits of snow sticking to their pale hair. Then I imagined her knowing that this would never happen again. Oh, Nadia, I said softly. She took a deep breath, shook her head, then grasped the railing as if to steady herself. This past winter, everything was different. People stayed inside, away from one another, hiding what little food they had. The village was absolutely silent. Usually, even in wintertime, we would hear a dog barking or the clop of a horse's hooves, but people had eaten all the cats and dogs and horses and even the birds. I couldn't help recoiling at the thought of people eating their pets. Nadia's eyes flashed. You can stand there and make a face, but if you had been there, you would have done it too. We were starving. Forgive me, I murmured, but I couldn't shake off my horror. Mama thought about leaving, taking us to Kyiv or north to Russia, where people said there was no famine, but it was impossible to buy train tickets, and the new system of passports made it illegal to leave. Mama traded her wedding ring for some bread at the Torgzin shop in Bielec Cerkva, walked 10 miles each way through the snow. But we quickly devoured the loaves she brought home, and she had nothing else to trade. We were so hungry, Mila. We had no energy to play, to work, to do anything, even cry, just lie there in a stupor and think about food. Mama and I ate less, gave the boys more, but it still wasn't enough. They were younger, weaker. Nadia began to sob. I rushed to embrace her. Antien died first, she choked out. He always slept next to me. February 9th, I woke up. He was already cold. I screamed, but what could Mama do? She closed his eyes, made the cross over him. Mikola was too tired to cry. The next evening, he died in Mama's arms. By this time, I was crying too. These boys, Antini and Mikola, were my cousins, my flesh and blood, and Papa had done nothing but turn his back on them. I'm sorry, I whispered. I'm sorry. For what? The state starved our family, murdered them, Nadia said. What could you have done, even as a child of privilege? Nothing. But Papa was the state, and I had been eating chocolates while my cousins starved. I had a sudden crazy urge to run off to Bielec Cerkva with all the food I could carry, but I'd be stopped, maybe even arrested. Nadia was right. There was nothing I could do, or almost nothing. Someday, will you show me their graves? I whispered. That's the thing. Nadia's voice broke. We couldn't even bury them properly. No one had the strength to dig graves, so we buried them in a common one. Mama wasn't right after that. She hardly ate, giving me what scraps we had left. Lomachenko, she said one night with a bitter laugh. Even our name means scrap. Nadia's eyes met mine. You know that, don't you? Lom is a scrap. I'd never thought about it, I said. I'd never thought about any of this.
Thank you, Katherine. Let's start with the basic but a very important question. Why did you choose these two passages to read to us today? Are they the two most important ones in the last year?
I would say that they are among the most important ones in the last year. I hope that there are many important passages, but in terms of sharing this story, I think they are very seminal. And the reason why is because of, the story I told you about hearing about this as a young person and from the family, and then feeling like that there was no awareness outside of the, Ukrainian community. It was interesting because some of the details from the second passage that I read were actually ones that were shared by my grandmother's cousin, and the specific detail of the village being absolutely silent because they'd eaten all the pets was one of the things that she told us. And I remember being a kid, and you mentioned that I love animals. I have a lot of animals in my house, and that as a child, it kind of horrified me. But it also really brought to life how much suffering there had been during this time. I do think it is incredibly important for people to know this experience and know this story. And I think we're in a time right now where we're really, opening ourselves up to some of these untold histories and these stories of marginalized communities. And I think that this is an important one, especially in light of current events.
Thank you. So you grew up knowing about the famine. The last year is your first book about Ukraine and its history. Why did you decide to write about the Holodomor and not something else,
Absolutely. That's a great question. Each of the cousins in the book really reflects a different generational kind of experience. Nadia really reflects sort of my grandmother's generation and their experience in some ways. Helen, the American character, was very much based on my mother, and I always wanted to write about her experience of trying to be American and yet, also sort of struggling with some of the issues of identity that Helen struggles with. When I was young, I was able to go to the Soviet Union. Maybe this is aging me a little bit, but I studied there. I had this very interesting experience where I was able to do a camp exchange, and I went to HREC, which is for anybody who knows the Soviet Union, was the sort of top, most elite communist youth camp. And I went on an exchange that was offered through the Samantha Smith program. And she was the little girl who had written a letter to Russia and had been invited there. And she passed away, but her mother started a foundation in her honor to bring Americans there as peace campers. But it was also a way for me to actually visit relatives that I had there. And that was the first time I was able to visit them. They were able to come to the camp. But that experience also gave me a sense of, what it was like to live in a communist state, which I think is something that's a lot of younger people, particularly in this country, don't understand, what that was like. And so I wanted to also write the character of Mila as somebody who, believed for a while in Stalinism and then saw the horrible, murderous truth behind it. I felt it was very important to have all three characters, to show somebody coming from sort of innocence to experience, to show somebody who is a sufferer and a victim, and to show somebody who is an ally, which is what Helen ends up being. And in that passage that I read, she mentions a cross. And that was actually, she hears about the famine when her father actually is hospitalized. He becomes very sick, and her mother kind of reveals that he's been worried about this. Helen decides that she's going to try to help by taking her cross, that her gold cross that her father gave her, and sewing it into the hem of a posilki, of a package. And this I actually took from my grandmother's experience, but she used to sew money and things into the hem of clothing that she would send to her family in Ukraine. So that was where I got the inspiration for that.
Thank you. The 2020 timeline of the last year, set during the COVID-19 pandemic, centers around Matthew, a teenage boy obsessed with the Nintendo game, The Legend of Zelda. Why did you decide to include a reference to this game? And how can the knowledge of Zelda help teachers discuss the last year?
I love this question. And I'm so glad you're actually the first person to ask. I get kids get very excited about Zelda. But oftentimes they ask me things like, have you gotten to this level and have you played this? And I'm like, I actually am not that big of a Zelda fan, and I have to defer to my own children. But this is an excellent question, because I have played the game, and I did choose it very consciously for this book. And Zelda is a story about regaining lost memory and about the power that you can have when you regain lost memory. And I felt that was such a wonderful analogy for the story of, the Holodomor, and specifically the way that, over time it was suppressed. There was the disinformation through Walter Duranty that shaped the story and made a lot of people just not know about it. It's increasingly, since their independence in, I believe it was 91, 92, this has come to light more and more and more. And I think with memory, with stories come power. And I was really interested in exploring that dynamic, but also relating it to something that kids would understand. And I started writing this book, as I mentioned, in 2019. Now that's like a world ago, right? I mean, that's really different than what's going on now. Everything was very different. And I started with the story of the three cousins. And then, I got some months into it. And of course, what happened to all of us is the pandemic. And I was stuck home with my teen children. They were very much doing the things Matthew does, which is dealing with their anxiety and disruption by a lot of screen time. I realized that there was so much trauma during the pandemic. In America, we lost 1 million people. And then even if you didn't lose someone, you had the disruption, you had the being out of school, all these things going on. And I felt like that was something that a young person would understand, how stressful that was. But a young person might not understand that there's a historical context for these periods of loss and trauma. For me, one of these periods was definitely the Holodomor. And I wanted to sort of give Matthew loves playing these games that are narrative, where he goes on a journey and he's a hero. And by uncovering his great-grandmother's story and learning the story of the Lomachenko family, which is his family, he ends up restoring memory in some ways and learning quite a large family secret, which hopefully no one will spoil. But something that really, changes the way he thinks about the world, but also contextualizes some of his own anxiety and fear. And gives him a connection to his great-grandmother. And as somebody who grew up with my grandmother, and I grew up in her house, we moved there when I was almost 5, and I lived with her until I went away to school. I guess I was, 16, 17. She was like a second mother to me. We had a really special relationship, and I'm an only child. So she was kind of like my second mother and my sibling, and like my co-conspirator, and she was also a marvelous storyteller. And so this book was really written in her honor to explore some of the history of her country.
Thank you. In the last year, we follow 4 characters who are teens: Matthew, Helen, Mila, and Nadia. Unlike the first 3, Nadia is not one of the narrators. Although she is the one who experiences the famine, we get to know her story largely from other people's perspectives. Why did you choose for her character not to narrate her own story and experiences of the Holodomor directly?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
Part of it is I feel that we have a lot of oral history. None of us now at this point, very few people, I don't want to say nobody because my grandmother's cousin lived to 106, but very few people have experienced this. And we're all now in the role of sort of being secondary sources. We're children, we're grandchildren of Holodomor survivors. And in some ways, I was writing the book for them. Is like, what do you do with a story? What's your responsibility? What is the importance of oral history? If a story has been passed down to you as the descendant of a Holodomor survivor, what do you do with that? I also wanted to explore the ways in which stories can not be believed, in which stories can be, discovered. This is such hard history. It is really difficult history. As somebody who writes for this age group, for, kids who are 10 to 14, I wanted to include some of the very dark details of it, including in the passage I read. But at the same time, I didn't want to overwhelm my readers. For example, I made editorial choices about subjects that I wanted to go into, both as a parent and an author, and things that I felt might be better served, also delivered up in sort of secondary by a character telling a character rather than being directly in the experience themselves. And there are other wonderful books that do that, but I just decided that, I was more comfortable sort of exploring Nadia's story through all the people who end up being its curators and its tenders. And the right way to do that is very much a big part of my book. Because there is a right way and there's a wrong way. I mean, it's an interesting one because in some ways, my family's background is most similar to Nadia's. Sometimes it's also hard to write about things when it's, so personal. It is a very, very difficult subject to write about. I was trying to tell that story, but also talk to kids and let kids explore the way that you should keep your family's stories and the way you should, write them down and the way you should sort of, keep these memories alive.
In the first passage you read, the teacher stresses the importance of reported facts over an author's fictional story narrative, even though we know that Walter Duranty wrote this information about the Holodomor. After confronting her teacher about Duranty's questionable reporting, Helen hears that the New York Times doesn't print lies. The teacher also tells the students, if you're going to make an argument, children, you need to use facts. You can't base it on stories or rumors. In your second passage, Nadia finally gives a partial oral history eyewitness account of the starvation of her family and the death of her brothers and her mother's demise after their death. This survivor story is told within the story that is your novel. To what extent are survivor accounts important to the truth of journalistic stories, to the characters in your story as they were looking for more information, and to your research for your novel?
I definitely looked at survivor accounts when I was doing this. I read both written ones. I read testimony to the US Congress. I talked to family members and got their recollections. It's so very important. Again, not to give too much of the book away, I'm not giving away some of the big secrets. Helen, after this encounter with her teacher, goes off and starts to collect oral histories. And she's inspired to do this by a girl in the class, Ruth, who's mentioned there, who's kind of very self-possessed and is Jewish. And her parents run a grocery store. She has some Jewish Ukrainian customers come in and she's heard these stories, some of these whispers. And she very much encourages, Helen to sort of, have a voice and try to write these down and capture these and almost do a kind of journalism. And what's interesting is that a lot of the characters in this book actually sort of learn to do some journalism. Matthew learns to sort of write down his grandmother's story. He starts getting interested in what happened. He starts researching. And Helen does the same thing. She starts to talk to people in the Ukrainian community about what they've heard, and to gather these accounts. And I think oral history is so important when it comes to, the history of the Soviet Union, of Eastern Europe, because there was such pressure to suppress a lot of experience. These oral histories are fundamental, I think, in terms of being able to capture this history. We're at a really important point. I think, Valentina mentioned it's the 90th anniversary. This is a point in which, not a lot of survivors are alive, very few, but their children and grandchildren are, and they've heard these stories. And so I really want to encourage people to write them down. And I think it is very important to sort of factor all of this in. And it's something that in the current conflict right now, one of the things that was amazing, it was amazing in a bad way, is I was writing this book. I had just finished the copy edits when the really major invasion by Russia of Ukraine began. There are so many historical parallels that were just coming out, like from the grain to the Russian propaganda, to the experience of children. Like there were so many things that were going on that were reflected. And I felt like this history is really important, not just to know because it's history, but as a contextualization. That was a whole other piece of this. As a writer and a journalist, it's important to look back at history and to try to get different views, to try to explore it, to try to hear personal narratives, and to really be careful, even with places. I mean, the New York Times is a wonderful paper. They do wonderful journalism. They had a great story today on Russian propaganda. But that doesn't take away the fact that they got it wrong in this one, this particular instance. And we do have to be critical readers. And that's something that I really think is built into this book, is the idea that we need our kids to be media literate. They need to not be like, and that's another reason I have Mila, her character in the book. She buys the propaganda for a long time. And it really shatters and shakes her world when she realizes that it's not so simple the way that the world is. And I think that was also a lesson that I wanted children, particularly in the United States, where there is a lot of polarization, there's a lot of us versus them thinking. I wanted them to be able to say, I've got to be critical. I've got to look at information and really think it through. And I've got to listen to a wide range of people, not just always the people in power.
Talking about the New York Times, let me remind all of the teachers that the last year was reviewed. It received a glowing review. It was reviewed together with Marcia Forchek-Skripek's Winter Kill. It was called a resistance novel for our times. Katherine, what would you like your readers, children and adults, to get from the last year?
I would say I would like them to get several things. I would first of all like them to know, just in a very basic level, that the Holodomor happened. I feel it's really important just to understand that basic fact. And many people don't, including adults and not just children. So that would be one thing. Another thing is to really think about how information is spread, what goes into reporting and journalism. This is a little bit of a love song to journalism as well, because I do believe in journalism. I believe that there are people who really do, including Gareth Jones, incredible work getting the true story. So that's another piece of it. I'd like them to think a little bit about this idea of trauma, both intergenerationally and in these historical periods, and today, including what's going on in Ukraine today, and the importance of story, both for sort of memorializing it, for capturing it, and for helping people heal as well. So that would be, probably the third important piece of it for me.
Thank you. And the last question, but a very important one. Are you planning to write another Ukrainian-themed novel?
This novel took a lot out of me. It took a lot of research. I had a number of scholars, including Dr. Daria Mattingly, who I know has a relationship with HREC, read it and help me through the history. I was very particular about trying to get a lot of things right that were very small, including the chocolate that Mila likes, which plays actually a kind of important role in the book. I am not just a historical fiction writer. In fact, the review you mentioned, the resistance novel for our time, was actually for Nowhere Boy, which is my last book, which is more contemporary. I did this book, the war happened. It's devastating to watch what's going on right now. It's hard because I also still keep in touch with family there. My next book is actually going back to Greek mythology, which I've written about before and is fantasy, because I needed to do something different. It was a passion project. I did it, for my grandmother. And then I just needed to do something different afterwards, because I was really emotionally kind of wiped out from it. It's difficult. This is really difficult subject material. And I really took care to try to shape it in a way that kids would find not overwhelming, but at the same time, that would really sort of bring this to life. That was my journey with this book.
Thank you, Katherine. Valentina, do you have any comments you want to make at this time?
Certainly. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to mention that the book is definitely suitable for middle years students, that is grades 5 and up to, I would say, grade 10, because the subject matter is about a teenager and it deals with topics that teenagers should be definitely aware of. It is interesting that the novel is set in contemporary United States and in the 1930s in Soviet Ukraine simultaneously, because you go from one to the other. And it features 2 girls in Ukraine who led completely different lives in Ukraine at that time. And they are Mila and Nadia, who were cousins. One represented the life of those who were in charge of the Communist Party in the 1930s and their children. And the other girl lived in a Ukrainian farming village whose life was affected by the Communist Party's decisions, and with her family suffered the effects of the Holodomor. We rarely have such a direct portrait of the 2 ways of life in a novel on the Holodomor. So I wanted to thank you for that. What happens in the story is that one of the adult characters is a party member or apparatchik who at the outset has no sympathy for the poor masses who are being starved. And in the end, he himself is arrested and suffers a similar fate. This book can be used by teachers easily to compare what life was like for the 2 girls in Ukraine. It's supposed to have been an egalitarian society. And it would be interesting for the kids to try to look at what life was like for the different classes, even though it was supposed to be a classless society. And also even to bring it up to scratch with the girl that was in the United States at that time, how different their lives were and what happened to them. And that could be easily done in the classroom with the teachers. And teachers could also have students gather information by looking at what was transpiring in Ukraine through the letters that were sent that you mentioned by the various characters in the 1930s. They could select, for example, 10 items about what was happening in Ukraine during the Holodomor from the novel. And then the students could write their own article about the situation in Ukraine for a school newspaper that they could then produce in their classroom. So just giving a few suggestions. Also, another thing that could be done is trying to get the students to identify at least 5 human rights abuses. May also be an assignment that could be done to have the kids look at how a society, what kind of values a society had, and what were they missing compared to the democratic values that we have in the United States and in Canada. And I think that would be very important. As with other webinars, we see the importance in this novel of the authors having a relative, a baba, who lived through a historical event like the Holodomor, and who had not spoken about it to her family, but she finally opens up about the truth of her past to an interested grandchild. So it's very important, and I think you mentioned that already, Katherine, that it's important for students to have a relationship with their grandparents, and that there is a story behind every person. And only when you become interested in them will they tell you the true story, and it'll enrich their lives as well. And of course, you can have an assignment out of that to write up the grandmother's story with a little bit of help from a teacher to help organize it. So I think it's a real treasure that you could use this book to be able to do that.
Thank you. We have lots of really interesting questions. The first question is from a fellow author, Amanda Macrina, who is the author of fantastic novels about Ukraine and Poland. Katherine, you talked a bit about the importance of eyewitnesses' testimony and also of journalism. What were some of your other favorite sources that you used to research this story? That's Amanda's question.
I really enjoyed my last talk along with Amanda as a fellow panelist. Yes. In terms of sources, I used so many different things. There were a number of books that I found were very useful, and I had a whole shelf full of them, everything from Red Famine. There's a book about childhood, Sheila Fitzpatrick. There is Stalinism, a book on that, which was fantastic. Serge Sipko, who's a Canadian, was very helpful in terms of, he has a book called Starving Ukraine, I believe, that was on the letters that were sent back and forth. And that was actually very helpful because I wasn't sure what was getting through, and originally thought, well, probably most of these letters weren't getting through. And he sort of corrected me, saying, well, some of them were, because the Soviet authorities wanted money to be sent, hard currency, to the Torgzin. So that was very useful. HREC has some great resources. There are Holodomor readers that have multiple oral histories. There's the U.S. congressional testimony back from the 80s. James Mace was running that effort to try to gather some of that. This was one of the most interesting things, is I had my relative, one of my relatives in Ukraine, he went back to the family village. They have a kind of a library / archive type thing. And he looked for information and found nothing there, even though people had experienced it. But he shared his memories that his grandmother, who is my grandmother's sister, told him, including some of the details that made it into the book, which included, the details like the carts bringing mass dead, through, various other things that they lived through it, they saw and they experienced. So that's just some of the sources that I used as I wrote this book, to try to sort of get at the experience of what it was like.
I'll read the question. Katherine, I love the book. I'm curious, is there any talk of it being made into a film? I could see it as a movie. Is there any chance the book will be translated into Ukrainian and be distributed in Ukraine?
Oh, wow. I would love that. I would love for it to be distributed and translated to Ukraine. So if anybody here knows how to do that, contact me. I know Ukraine has some other things to handle right now beyond just translating my book, but that would be a great honor. I tried to write it cinematically. I know there's a huge film community in Canada. There's also a really wonderful Ukrainian community there. So perhaps somebody will embrace this as a movie. That would be my hope.
What went into your decision not to include any scene in the village, in the rural Ukraine where people suffered most? Did your great aunt not have that experience, or is it that you wanted to avoid too much horror in writing for young people?
Yeah, this is a very similar question to the one you asked, Matuj. And our family was in a small village, and they did experience this. And as I said, one of those cousins even immigrated to the US, and it really did have an intergenerational effect on her family. She had passed away by the time I started writing this book, but I'm very close with her granddaughter, my cousin Andrea, who's in Germany, and then also with her children, who are, older people now, but were able to share what it was like, and how she really didn't talk about it much, but it was looming all the time. My grandmother left in 1928, so she did not experience the famine firsthand, but she definitely was trying to help her family, similarly to Helen's family. And she did live through the earlier famine in the 20s. And she was very obsessed with food. for me and my two cousins, we always remember her saying, eat, 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 eat. You know, she had a very thick accent. Eat, eat, darling, eat. You know, that was sort of something that I think was very much part of the fiber of her being, having lived through famine. As I explained earlier, I really partly made that decision in part because I wanted this story to be a little bit about the story of how this famine didn't kind of reach the rest of the world for so long. You know, we both see the suppression, I felt like, through Mila's story, and we see, you know, what the sort of Soviet line was and understand that. There were so many stories that were lost. Third reason, as I mentioned, is that I felt that the story of listening to this was powerful enough, and I was worried a little bit about setting the character in the village, you know, about the sort of how I would deal with some of the more difficult pieces of this. So that's why I made the decision. It's really about storytellers in many ways.
Talking about age-appropriate things, we have a few questions about the reception of children. What kind of questions do you get from children when you speak with them about the book? What do your children say about the book? Have you encountered any resistance to this book or denial?
I was just trying to find an email I got from a kid yesterday. It was very interesting because this is an American child who does not have Ukrainian roots. She said, you know, I really related to this book. I related to the idea, you know, of a family that also immigrates and moves. But I also didn't know about this whole thing with the Soviet Union and the famine and the starvation. And that's exactly the type of email I'm really pleased to get. The way I kind of hand sell this book to children is very different than the way I'm talking to you now about it as an educator and a teacher. And I really talk a lot about, you know, Matthew sort of having to play detective and having to kind of figure out what the true story is and use his critical skills as a listener to figure that out. The reader, that when you read this book, you're on a race against Matthew. That's what I say to the kids. See if you could figure out what the secret of the book is before Matthew does. And if you figure it out, write me and tell me what page you found it on. I've had kids write, and they definitely like it's very interesting. Most of them figure it out around when Matthew does. I've had a few adults say they figured it out earlier, but the kids are probably right there with him, which is kind of, you know, my intention.
Yeah, there is a twist in the novel. Yeah.
I mean, I'm a mystery writer. That's sort of the other thing I do is, even though I write across genres, a lot of my books have mysteries in them. And so that was very central to kind of, you know, creating narrative momentum about this as well. The other thing I always feel with middle grade is it's important to have hope. Even if you're telling a very dark story, which I've done in several books, it's important to end on a note of hope. And this is a very sad story. This is a very sad part of history. But I think where we can find some sort of meaning and hope in it is in how we preserve it.
Do you have more thoughts on the relevance of your book to today's events in Ukraine? Has the war given you a different prism to look at the experiences your aunt told you?
I definitely think that there's been evolution, you know, in terms of thinking about the history of Ukraine. Sergei Plokhy's book, I read that, you know, that was a while ago, but it's obviously I'm thinking more about the history beyond just the 20th century, you know, and I think that there's evolution of identity going on as well for a lot of people. I have a mixed identity, and I think it's important to point that out, that I am not 100% Ukrainian. I'm a quarter Ukrainian. All of my family is from that area. My father's family is Jewish, and they're from Belarus and Romania. And my mother's family are half Ukrainian and half from Belarus. I think identity in that region can be very complicated. And there are a lot of stories, and there's a lot of tragedy and a lot of darkness. And I think it's important to tell all those stories and to try to do that as honestly as possible. In terms of the war today, of course, there are historical pieces, as I mentioned, that have jumped out at me, you know, having to do with Russia trying to control Ukrainian grain, having to do with Russian propaganda, having to do with, you know, children. And this book is very much about the experience of children in the Soviet Union and in Soviet Ukraine. And there are so many orphans, you know, that Valentina and I were just talking about, you know, how people were taken away off to the camps and to Siberia, and especially during the collectivization period, a lot of parents disappeared, and there were a lot of political orphans. How those orphans were sort of, taken by the state and, kind of forced to, adopt a different mindset and pulled away from their culture, I think is a very familiar thread with today as well.
It's so important that you address Walter Durante's misrepresentation and, in fact, denial of the Holodomor. Did you ever encounter any denial of the Holodomor as you were writing? How would you suggest readers respond to denial or to disinformation?
I was fortunate enough, possibly because of all the people I spoke to, that there was no denial, although I was very much aware of the denial, the historical denial and the current denial, by the Soviet Union, by Russia. I would say in terms of, this denial, it's like, read the histories, talk to people who have, who are descendants, read this book, read some of the other books. I truly wish that there was more of people reading stories that make them somewhat uncomfortable, and being able to listen. And that's finally what Mila has to do. And that is, I think, a very important thing to do, is to listen to stories beyond just what the government is telling you or what, the people in your own life are telling you, like Mila's father.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for the remaining questions, but I would like to thank the audience for the thought-provoking questions. And thank you, Katherine, most especially for joining us and sharing your creative process with us. Valentina, could we have your closing remarks, please?
Definitely. I would like to extend our thanks to Katherine Marsh, our wonderful author, for writing this moving and very interesting novel, The Lost Year, and for discussing it with us today. Thank you also to Mateusz Switlitsky for gracing us with his knowledge and expertise in hosting this webinar. Congratulations to you both for doing a fabulous job. It's been a real pleasure. For everyone who came to participate tonight, in the chat, you will find a list you can download before you leave of sources about the Holodomor that are suitable for different grade levels that you may be interested in using in your classrooms. Our next Thursday evening webinar will be on October the 19th, 2023, at this same time. We will be looking at and discussing a Canadian author, Kat Karpenko's novel, The Photograph with Her, to commemorate this year's Holodomor Memorial Day in schools, which will be coming up in November on the fourth Friday of the month. For additional information about the Holodomor and our webinar series, please visit our website, education.holodomor.ca. It also has plenty of teacher resources and teaching materials for your use. Also, please consider applying for our annual HREC Educator Award for Holodomor lesson plan development, which is on our website. The deadline to apply is May the 1st, and if you can't do it this year, you can do it next year. It's an annual award. And if you don't have it already, please download our annual Holodomor Memorial Day pamphlet, which highlights an announcement and other resources to use in the classroom for Holodomor Memorial Day in schools on November 24th of this year. And if you need a text for teaching the Holodomor, there is information about my book entitled Holodomor in Ukraine for Teachers and Students on our website as well. Thank you all for participating and for your interest in the Holodomor. Today, Russia's war on Ukraine continues, and we see in it some of the things happening in today's war that are very similar to what happened to the Ukrainian people during the Holodomor in the 1930s, especially what is happening to the children of Ukraine today, as Katherine mentioned. At least 16,226 children have been deported from Russian orphanages or taken from their parents and placed in youth camps in Russia or adopted and are being re-educated as Russians. This number of children is just the recorded and verified number. Many specialists believe the actual number is much larger. We see that in this and in other ways, the Kremlin's genocidal intentions for Ukraine and its people remain the same as they were in the 1930s during the Holodomor. Today's Russian war on Ukraine demonstrates the relevance of learning about the Holodomor to current events, and we are very grateful to all the authors who have written novels about the Holodomor and bring it to the awareness of today's youth. With this, we will be ending our webinar today. Thank you for your attendance, and God bless everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.